At the divorce hearing, my husband was smug and arrogant. He sneered and confidently declared that I would never get another dime from him. His mother smiled from the gallery and loudly whispered that someone like me did not deserve anything. The judge opened the letter I had just submitted, skimmed through a few lines, and then suddenly burst out laughing. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom. He calmly adjusted his glasses, looked down at my husband, and asked what exactly this was. In an instant, their faces turned pale with absolute fear. They thought they had backed me into a corner and stripped me of everything I owned. They had no idea that the document in the judge's hand was about to send them straight to federal prison. My name is Naomi. I am 34 years old. If you have ever given your heart and soul to build a man up, only to have him and his toxic family try to tear you down. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to this channel, because you are going to want to hear every single detail of how I took back my power and orchestrated the ultimate payback against my ex-husband. The devastating reality of my marriage shattered on a humid Friday night in Atlanta. It was the 5-year anniversary gala for my husband's real estate technology company. Andre and I had been married for 8 years. For the first 5 of those years, I worked grueling 80-hour weeks as a financial auditor to keep a roof over our heads. I paid the mortgage, covered the utility bills, and funded his startup dreams while he sat in our living room pitching ideas to investors. I sacrificed my own comfort wearing outdated clothes and skipping vacations just so Andre could afford his expensive suits and networking dinners. I believed we were building an empire together as a solid team. But as soon as his company secured its first major round of venture capital funding, everything changed completely. Andre began to view me not as the foundation of his success, but as a tedious reminder of his humble beginnings. He started complaining that I was too analytical, too rigid, and lacked the sophisticated polish required for his new elite social circle in Buckhead. His mother Beatrice and his sister Vanessa eagerly fueled this narrative. They had always looked down on me because I valued hard work over designer labels and exclusive country club memberships. Tonight was supposed to be a joyful celebration of everything we had built. I had spent hours getting ready, wearing a tasteful black evening gown that I bought specifically for this occasion. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the luxury hotel, expecting to stand proudly by my husband's side. The room was dripping with wealth, filled with crystal chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and the most influential figures in the Atlanta business community. As I stepped through the double doors, I scanned the room for Andre. Instead, I was immediately intercepted by Beatrice and Vanessa. Beatrice wore a flashy, sequined dress that caught the light, and her lips curled into a condescending smirk the moment she saw me. Vanessa stood beside her, sipping expensive champagne and eyeing my outfit with blatant disgust. They blocked my path like two heavily perfumed bouncers. Beatrice leaned in, her voice dripping with fake pity, telling me that I looked terribly out of place among these important people. She said my dress was too simple for an event of this magnitude and suggested I should have consulted a professional stylist. I kept my expression neutral, refusing to let them see how their words stung. I politely asked where my seat was, assuming I would be placed at the head table with Andre. Vanessa laughed, a sharp and cruel sound that drew the attention of nearby guests. She pointed toward the back of the ballroom near the swinging doors of the kitchen. She told me they had arranged a special spot for me at the assistants table right next to the event staff and the coat check attendants. I stared at her in disbelief, demanding to know why the wife of the chief executive officer was being seated with the event staff. Beatrice stepped closer and whispered that Andre needed to project a high-class image tonight. She said he needed to be surrounded by dynamic, high-status individuals, and my presence at the main table would drag down his brand. She told me to go sit in the back. I pushed past them, my heart pounding against my ribs, and walked directly toward the VIP family table at the front of the room. What I saw there made my blood run cold. Andre was sitting in the center seat, looking incredibly handsome in a tailored tuxedo, laughing and clinking glasses with major investors. But the seat next to him, the seat reserved for his wife, was occupied by a woman named Sienna. Sienna was his newly hired director of public relations. She was wearing a stunning, backless crimson gown and leaning intimately into Andre's shoulder. Her hand rested casually on his thigh under the table. They looked exactly like a powerful, wealthy power couple holding court at their own celebration. I stood a few feet away, feeling completely invisible in a room full of people whose salaries were paid by the company I helped finance. My husband did not even notice me standing there. He was too busy leaning down to whisper something into Sienna's ear, causing her to throw her head back in melodic laughter. The sheer disrespect was suffocating. I had emptied my savings account to buy the servers that launched his initial software platform. I had skipped meals so he could take potential clients out for expensive lunches. And here he was publicly replacing me with a flashy public relations director, while his mother and sister banished me to the kitchen doors. I realized in that terrible moment that my family had been conspiring against me right in front of my face. I refused to walk away quietly. I approached the table, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor. I stopped right behind Andre's chair. When I said his name, his head snapped around. The easy smile vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer annoyance. Sienna looked up at me, her eyes sweeping over my simple black dress, before she gave me a sickly sweet smile that matched Beatrice perfectly. Andre stood up quickly, grabbing my elbow and steering me away from the investors before I could say another word. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into my skin as he pulled me into a quiet hallway just outside the ballroom. I yanked my arm away, demanding an immediate explanation. I asked him why his public relations director was sitting in my chair and why his family had tried to humiliate me. Andre let out a long sigh as if I were a petulant child throwing a tantrum. He looked me up and down with cold eyes. He told me I was overreacting, that Sienna was crucial for the company image, and that I simply did not fit into the lifestyle he was building. He said I was too focused on numbers and spreadsheets to understand networking. He told me to accept reality and stop causing drama. I felt a knot form in my throat, but I refused to shed a tear. I reminded him that my spreadsheets were the only reason he was not still living in a cramped apartment pitching ideas to empty rooms. I reminded him of the 8 years of my life I had dedicated to his success. Andre did not flinch. His expression remained completely devoid of empathy. He reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick folded manila envelope. He held it out to me. When I asked what it was, he did not hesitate. He told me it was a divorce petition. He said our marriage had been over for a long time and that he was moving on to a future that required a partner who matched his current social standing. He demanded I sign the papers immediately. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers, my eyes scanning the legal jargon. According to the document, Andre was claiming his multi-million-dollar company was his separate property, protected under a loophole his attorneys had drafted. He offered zero spousal support, zero equity, and demanded I vacate our home within 30 days. He smirked, bragging he had secured his assets and I was legally entitled to nothing. He told me to sign and walk away quietly, warning that if I tried to fight him, his legal team would ruin me financially. I stared down at the thick stack of divorce papers, feeling the weight of his betrayal. Section 2. 1,500 words. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing a single tear fall from my eyes. I looked up from the harsh legal print of the divorce petition and met his gaze directly. His eyes were cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of the warmth we had shared over the past 8 years. He held out a sleek silver pen, fully expecting me to break down, throw a massive tantrum, or beg him to reconsider abandoning our marriage. He wanted a dramatic scene. He wanted me to act like the hysterical, overly emotional woman his family always claimed I was. Instead, I took the pen from his hand with absolute steadiness. I flipped to the back page of the petition, pressed the tip against the signature line, and signed my name using bold, deliberate strokes. I handed the pen back to him, shoved the thick manila envelope hard against his chest, and turned on my heel. I walked out of that opulent ballroom without looking back even once. I completely ignored the confused whispers of his wealthy investors and the arrogant, victorious chuckles coming from his mother and sister. I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night, the heavy summer air hitting my face as I handed my valet ticket to the attendant. The neon lights of the bustling city reflected in the puddles on the street, providing a stark contrast to the dark reality of my current situation. I drove my modest sedan away from the glittering hotel, leaving my marriage and my entire past behind in the rearview mirror. The coordinated assault on my character began before the sun even rose the next morning. Beatrice wasted absolutely no time leveraging her prestigious position at our elite megachurch in downtown Atlanta. As the head of the event planning committee and a prominent elder, she commanded a massive, highly loyal audience. By the time Sunday service started, her twisted narrative was already fully established across the congregation. I sat alone in my quiet apartment, watching the service via their live internet stream, and listened as the head pastor asked the entire church to bow their heads and pray for Andre during his difficult season of profound heartbreak. Beatrice had meticulously painted me as an unstable, wildly greedy woman who had callously abandoned her successful husband the very moment he finally achieved his lifelong dreams. She moved through the aisles with practiced grace, whispering to the influential church ladies that I suffered from severe mental health issues. She claimed I had grown violently jealous of Andre's professional success and his rising status in the community. She completely erased the grueling 80-hour work weeks I had endured to fund his tech startup. She conveniently forgot the countless times I paid her own utility bills when Andre was completely broke. In her fabricated version of reality, I was a heartless gold digger who tried to drain his accounts and walked out when he bravely refused to fund my extravagant lifestyle. The sheer hypocrisy was utterly nauseating. She sat in the front pew wearing a custom designer hat purchased with the very money I had generated, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief, while the massive congregation murmured in collective sympathy for her poor abandoned son. The social isolation was immediate, swift, and entirely brutal. Women I had prayed with for years suddenly stopped answering my phone calls. Church members who had eaten countless meals at my dining table quickly deleted me from their social media circles, afraid of drawing the ire of the powerful church leadership. Beatrice knew exactly how to wield social power in Atlanta, turning my entire support system against me with a few carefully whispered lies disguised as genuine prayer requests. But the public humiliation at church was only one layer of their highly coordinated attack. The private harassment I endured was absolutely relentless. My phone screen lit up constantly with incoming text messages from Vanessa and her husband Kendrick. Kendrick served as the chief financial officer for Andre's technology company, a crucial title he held mostly because he was married to the chief executive's sister, rather than possessing any actual financial acumen. He and Vanessa fed off Andre's arrogance like parasites, perfectly content to ride his coattails to immense wealth. Vanessa sent me a high-resolution picture of Sienna holding a crystal glass of champagne at the company brunch, adding a cruel caption that openly mocked my absence. She told me the company was finally operating at an elite level now that the deadweight had been permanently removed. She ruthlessly insulted my conservative wardrobe, my natural hairstyle, and my dedicated career, calling me a pathetic paper pusher who never deserved to sit at the king's table in the first place. She bragged about how Sienna was already picking out new imported furniture for the executive office, erasing my presence from the company headquarters entirely. She wanted to make sure I knew I had been replaced by someone they deemed superior in every way. Kendrick joined the digital assault shortly after his wife. He sent a rapid series of laughing emojis followed by a lengthy, arrogant message mocking my decision to sign the divorce papers so quickly. He called me stupid for walking away empty-handed without putting up a fierce legal fight. He bragged extensively about the massive new company bonuses he and Andre were setting up for the upcoming fiscal quarter, explicitly stating that I would never see a single penny of that newfound wealth. He told me to enjoy my miserable, lonely life, analyzing boring spreadsheets in a tiny cubicle while they bought luxury yachts and sprawling vacation homes in the Caribbean. He continuously belittled my profession as a financial auditor, calling my daily work irrelevant and low-class compared to their visionary technology enterprise. Their cruelty was entirely deliberate, meant to break my spirit and crush my self-esteem. They wanted me to feel utterly worthless, completely alone, and desperate for validation. I sat on my sofa reading their hateful words, refusing to type a single response. Engaging with them would only provide the dramatic reaction they desperately craved. They wanted to see me unravel. They wanted tangible proof of the mental instability Beatrice was actively preaching about to the vast congregation. I silenced my notifications and tossed the heavy phone onto the solid oak coffee table. I needed to remain completely level-headed. I knew that surviving this deep betrayal required cold, calculated logic rather than messy, emotional outbursts. I took a deep breath, focusing my mind entirely on the monumental tasks ahead. However, Andre was not finished tightening the invisible noose around my neck. He wanted to ensure my complete subjugation. 2 days after the gala, I walked into a local neighborhood pharmacy to pick up my routine allergy medication. The pharmacist swiped my health insurance card, frowned deeply at his glowing computer screen, and informed me that my coverage had been abruptly terminated. A cold chill washed over me as the grim reality of my situation began to set in. I stepped aside, walked out to the sun-baked parking lot, pulled out my laptop, and connected to a public wireless network to log into my secure banking portal. The screen loaded slowly, eventually revealing a truly devastating reality. Our joint checking account, which held the significant emergency funds I had diligently saved from my own auditing salary over the past 8 years, showed a balance of exactly zero. Andre had systematically drained every single dollar from the account. He had maliciously locked me out of the high-yield savings accounts, canceled my primary credit cards, and revoked my comprehensive health insurance coverage with a single phone call to the corporate provider. He wanted to cripple me financially so I would have absolutely no resources to hire a competent divorce attorney to review his highly questionable separation agreement. He believed that by cutting off my access to my own hard-earned money, I would be forced into immediate submission. He assumed I was just a naive, dependent wife who did not truly understand how complex corporate finances operated. He thought I would panic, break down, and crawl back to him on my hands and knees, gratefully accepting whatever meager financial settlement he decided to toss my way to keep me quiet. He thought he had completely neutralized any possible threat I posed to his rapidly expanding real estate technology empire. He wanted me broken, destitute, and begging for basic survival in a busy city that his mother had already turned entirely against me. He believed his position of power was absolute, unchallenged, and completely untouchable. He was operating under the arrogant assumption that I was weak and utterly defenseless. My phone vibrated violently in my hand, pulling my intense attention away from the glaring zero balance on my laptop screen. A new text message appeared on the locked screen. It was from Andre. I opened the message and stared at the glowing black letters. I read the single line of text he had sent, a cruel message meant to be the final nail in the coffin of my independence and pride. Beg, and I might give you enough for rent. I stared at the glowing screen of my phone, reading the pathetic ultimatum Andre had sent. He expected me to shatter. He anticipated a desperate, weeping phone call begging for my own money back so I could afford groceries. I did not reply. I did not shed a tear. I simply pressed the power button, plunging the screen into total darkness, and tossed the device onto the passenger seat of my car. Let him wait for a surrender that would never arrive. I turned the ignition and merged onto the bustling Atlanta highway, driving away from the neighborhood pharmacy and heading straight into the affluent heart of Midtown. Andre and his parasitic family truly believed they knew every single detail about my life. They assumed I was just a docile, unremarkable woman who spent her days pushing papers and balancing mundane spreadsheets in a drab corporate cubicle. They were painfully, disastrously mistaken. I bypassed the modest suburbs entirely and pulled my sedan into the secured underground parking garage of a glittering, glass-encased high-rise building. I swiped a sleek black key card at the private elevator bank, granting me direct access to the penthouse level. The polished doors slid open silently, revealing my actual sanctuary. I stepped into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar apartment boasting panoramic views of the entire Atlanta skyline. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the hardwood floors in bright, natural light. Leather furniture decorated the space perfectly. This was not the home of a struggling, discarded housewife. This was the fortress of a woman who controlled massive capital. Andre thought I funded his early tech startup using meager savings scraped together from a mid-level accounting job. He never bothered to ask how I managed to keep our household afloat while single-handedly bankrolling his server costs, his marketing campaigns, and his initial payroll. He was too arrogant to look past his own ego. The absolute truth was that I am a top-tier forensic financial auditor and a highly successful anonymous venture capitalist. Under a heavily guarded corporate alias, I manage a private equity portfolio worth tens of millions of dollars. My professional specialty is not just funding promising startups, but ruthlessly dismantling corrupt corporate structures. Over the past 6 years, I have systematically exposed 3 fraudulent chief executive officers, dismantled 2 massive illegal investment schemes, and legally eviscerated a corrupt hedge fund manager who thought he could easily outsmart the federal government. I follow the money, and the money never lies. Andre mistook my quiet humility for weakness. He mistook my frugal wardrobe and lack of flashy designer handbags for financial incompetence. He never realized that the woman washing his dishes was simultaneously orchestrating multi-million-dollar corporate buyouts from her laptop. I walked straight past the luxury kitchen and entered my private home office. This room was the nerve center of my entire covert operation. 3 massive, ultra-high-definition curved monitors dominated the desk. The polished mahogany surface gleamed under the soft lighting. A specialized encrypted server tower hummed quietly in the corner, protected by military-grade firewalls and complex biometric security protocols. I placed my right hand on the glowing fingerprint scanner, waking the entire system from its dormant state. The large screens flared to life, instantly illuminating the dark room with cascading lines of code, complex financial dashboards, and heavily encrypted communication channels. I took a seat in my ergonomic leather chair, cracked my knuckles slowly, and prepared to go to work. If Andre wanted to play a high-stakes game of financial warfare, I was going to show him what a true apex predator actually looked like in action. He loudly claimed his real estate technology company was his sole separate property, supposedly protected by an ironclad legal loophole drafted by his expensive corporate attorneys. But Andre made one fatal, incredibly arrogant mistake. Because he constantly viewed me as a harmless, obedient wife, he had never bothered to revoke my administrative access to the company backend. For years, I was the one who balanced the initial books, filed the early tax returns, and established the foundational accounting software his entire enterprise still relied upon every single day. My digital fingerprints were deeply embedded in the very architecture of his corporate network. I pulled up the primary financial software and initiated a silent, untraceable login using my original master administrative credentials. The loading bar filled quickly, granting me total access without triggering any security alarms or sending any loud warning notifications. I was inside. The entire financial anatomy of Andre's highly praised company lay completely exposed before me on the bright screens. I deliberately bypassed the superficial profit and loss statements designed to dazzle gullible investors and immediately dug into the raw, unfiltered general ledgers. I initiated a comprehensive forensic extraction protocol pulling every single transaction invoice, payroll record, and wire transfer from the past 36 months. I split the heavy data streams across my 3 monitors, creating a complex visual web of money flowing continuously in and out of the corporate accounts. The initial numbers looked perfectly healthy on the surface. Revenue was climbing steadily, client acquisitions were up significantly, and venture capital injections were properly categorized. It was exactly the kind of flawless financial facade that Kendrick, acting as the chief financial officer, would proudly present to the eager board of directors during quarterly meetings. But I never look at the surface. I look for the hidden anomalies, the tiny mathematical discrepancies that arrogant men always leave behind when they get too comfortable. I deployed a custom tracking algorithm I had written specifically to flag irregular banking patterns, dummy vendor payments, and unverified offshore transfers. I sat back and watched the program sift through millions of lines of financial data at lightning speed. Hours passed quickly. The sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline outside, casting the city in vibrant shades of deep orange and purple. I did not move from my chair. My focus remained completely locked on. Slowly, the pristine illusion of Andre's successful tech empire began to unravel right in front of my eyes. The algorithm triggered its first red flag on a series of massive consulting fees paid to a third-party vendor I had never heard of before. I isolated the transactions immediately and traced the vendor identification number through public records. The payments were strangely consistent, perfectly rounded numbers authorized directly by Kendrick on the last Friday of every single month without fail. I pulled the corresponding invoices from the secure server. They were incredibly vague billing for strategic marketing consultations and general brand alignment services. But the consulting company listed on the invoice had no digital footprint, no physical office address, and no registered employees anywhere in the state of Georgia. It was a classic ghost corporation used specifically for draining cash. I cross-referenced the routing numbers on the outbound wire transfers and quickly discovered the money was not going to a legitimate corporate bank account. It was being funneled quietly into a private wealth management fund located several states away. My fingers flew across the keyboard rapidly as I expanded the specific search parameters, instructing the algorithm to hunt for any transaction matching that specific routing structure. The center screen blinked rapidly, flooding with bright red alerts. It was not just one ghost corporation. The network of fake businesses was vast and highly organized, stretching across multiple jurisdictions. I could clearly see the elaborate deception unfolding in front of me. There were 5 distinct ghost entities. They were all aggressively billing Andre's company for exorbitant, completely fabricated services every single month. Management fees, software licensing upgrades, real estate assessment charges, and international logistics consulting fees flooded the ledger. I meticulously tracked the outbound capital over the last 2 fiscal quarters, adding up the fraudulent disbursements line by line. The final numbers climbed higher and higher, revealing a staggering level of financial corruption running rampant through the organization. I zoomed in on the primary operational funds account, the very lifeblood of the technology startup. The balance currently displayed on the official shareholder reports was robust and healthy, showing millions in liquid capital supposedly ready to be deployed for future expansion and software development. I completely bypassed the automatically generated report and pinged the actual real-time bank balance directly through the backdoor access portal. The glaring discrepancy hit me like a massive physical blow to the chest. The money was absolutely gone. I stared at the final, verified tally on my screen, my heart pounding heavily with a chaotic mixture of pure shock and cold, calculated triumph. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with terrifying clarity. Andre and Kendrick had orchestrated a massive hidden financial hemorrhage behind closed doors. Millions of dollars were missing from the startup's operational funds, secretly drained to line their own pockets while pretending to be legitimate business leaders. They thought they destroyed me, but they had handed me the exact weapon to annihilate them both. I did not waste a single second celebrating my discovery. In the world of forensic auditing, finding the missing money is only the first step of the battle. Proving exactly where it went and who authorized the transfer is what actually puts arrogant men behind bars. I leaned closer to the glowing monitors, my eyes darting across the digital paper trail. Kendrick had always been a loud, flashy man who loved to boast about his financial genius at family barbecues. I always knew he was intellectually lazy, but seeing his actual methodology laid bare on my screen was almost insulting. He was not a criminal mastermind. He was just a greedy amateur who left a trail of breadcrumbs wide enough for a novice accountant to follow. I opened a new encrypted terminal and began constructing a visual flowchart to map out his entire money laundering operation. The structure was incredibly repetitive. First, Kendrick would authorize a massive payment to one of the 5 domestic ghost corporations I had already identified. Kendrick was aggressively bouncing the funds through a secondary layer of regional banks, trying to intentionally muddy the transaction history. He believed he was untraceable. I pulled up his employment file, remembering how Andre had forcefully handed him the executive role simply because he married Vanessa. Kendrick had absolutely no formal education in corporate finance, no certified public accountant license, and absolutely no business handling multi-million-dollar capital investments. He relied entirely on automated software templates to do his daily job. His sheer incompetence was currently leaving a massive, glowing digital footprint across the entire southeastern banking grid. Every single time he moved the stolen money, he used the exact same virtual private network IP address, completely failing to mask his physical location. He split the large deposits into dozens of smaller random increments. It was a classic placement and layering technique designed specifically to confuse standard automated banking audits. But my algorithms were not standard. I wrote a specific script to gather all those fractured transactions and rebuild the original sum. Watching the progress bar fill on my center screen, I felt a deep surge of vindication. Vanessa had spent the entire afternoon sending me cruel text messages, mocking my conservative wardrobe and calling me a pathetic paper pusher. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was actively committing federal wire fraud to fund her lavish shopping sprees. I wondered how loudly she would laugh when federal agents inevitably kicked down the custom mahogany doors of her sprawling suburban mansion. The tracking algorithm finished compiling the fragmented data and presented a unified geographic destination. The money was not staying within the borders of the United States. Kendrick was funneling every single stolen dollar out of the country. The final domestic wire transfers all pointed directly to an international clearinghouse located in Miami. From there, the capital was immediately swept into a highly obfuscated offshore trust. I cracked my knuckles again, feeling the familiar adrenaline rush that always accompanied a high-stakes financial hunt. I routed my connection through a secure virtual private network located in Switzerland, masking my digital footprint entirely. I needed to pierce the veil of the Miami clearinghouse without triggering any automated security alerts that might notify Kendrick of the breach. I ran a targeted penetration protocol, slipping past the superficial security layers and accessing the outbound international transfer logs. The data decoded, slowly translating the complex alphanumeric strings into readable banking information. The destination coordinates finally stabilized on my right monitor. The missing millions were resting safely in the Cayman Islands. A cynical smile crossed my face. The Cayman Islands were the ultimate cliché for amateur corporate criminals trying to hide stolen wealth. Andre and Kendrick clearly believed that moving the cash to the Caribbean made it completely untouchable. They thought they could starve me out during the divorce proceedings by claiming the company was entirely broke while secretly hoarding millions in a tropical tax haven. Once the divorce was finalized and I was discarded with nothing, they would simply repatriate the funds under the guise of foreign investment capital and continue living like kings. It was an incredibly malicious, highly coordinated plot designed specifically to ruin my entire life. But they severely underestimated the woman they were trying to destroy. I opened my specialized international corporate registry database, a highly restricted platform I utilized regularly. This database granted me direct access to offshore incorporation documents that were typically shielded from the general public. I typed in the specific account routing numbers generated by the Miami clearinghouse and initiated a deep background search. The system churned through thousands of protected offshore files, searching for the exact corporate entity attached to the Cayman bank account receiving Andre's stolen operational funds. The blue loading circles spun endlessly against the black background of my monitor. The tension in my home office was absolute. I knew that uncovering the name of the shell company would provide the definitive proof I needed to destroy their entire empire. The computer chimed softly, indicating a successful match. The official offshore incorporation documents for the hidden Cayman Shell Company finally appeared clearly on my bright center screen, displaying the unredacted corporate details perfectly. The entity was registered under the name Apex Holdings International. It was classified as an offshore wealth management trust, incorporated exactly 4 weeks before Andre asked for a divorce. I quickly scrolled past the standard registration jargon, the local Cayman address, and the boilerplate legal disclaimers. I was hunting for the final piece of the puzzle, I needed the name of the authorized managing director. I expected to see Kendrick's name given his role as the chief financial officer handling the transfers. I also expected to see Andres' name since he was the primary beneficiary of the entire fraudulent scheme. I scrolled to the final page of the digital document expanding the image to clearly read the officially notarized signature block. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned closer to the monitor, my eyes scanning the bold black text perfectly typed on the official registration form. The sole proprietor and exclusive managing director of Apex Holdings International was not Andre. It was not Kendrick. The name staring back at me belonged to the very woman who had spent the entire morning standing at the pulpit of our elite megachurch, shedding crocodile tears, and publicly begging the congregation to pray for her poor, victimized son. The name on the offshore account was Beatrice. I sat back in my leather chair, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of the revelation. My mother-in-law, the self-righteous, highly respected church elder who constantly preached about morality and grace, was the primary beneficiary of a multi-million-dollar international money laundering operation. Beatrice was the one holding the stolen cash. Suddenly, every single piece of their vicious gaslighting campaign made perfect sense. Beatrice was not just being a protective, overbearing mother defending her successful son. She was actively participating in a massive federal crime. She needed to destroy my reputation within the Atlanta community, immediately painting me as crazy and unstable, so that no one would believe a single word I said if I ever managed to uncover the missing money. She was using her immense social power and religious influence as a thick shield to deflect any possible scrutiny from her own horrific financial crimes. She thought she was utterly untouchable, protected by her fancy church hats and her legion of loyal praying friends. She thought she could steal millions, help throw her daughter-in-law out into the street and suffer absolutely no consequences. The rage that had been quietly simmering inside my chest suddenly crystallized into pure icy focus. Andre and Kendrick were fools, but Beatrice was the true architect of my public humiliation. I pressed my fingers against the keyboard, quickly downloading every single page of the Cayman Islands Incorporation documents, the forged invoices, and the detailed wire transfer logs. I secured the massive data packet onto a heavily encrypted external hard drive. The evidence was irrefutable, undeniable, and entirely devastating. I had everything I needed to trigger a catastrophic federal investigation, but handing this over to the authorities immediately would be far too merciful. It would drag me into years of messy public litigation, and they might still find a way to hide behind expensive defense attorneys. No, I wanted to patiently watch them slowly burn from the inside out. I wanted to trap them all in a tight corner, where neither their heavily guarded stolen money nor their incredibly elite social status could ever save them from total ruin. They needed to suffer. The entire power dynamic had officially shifted in my favor tonight, and the real deeply calculated game was just beginning right now today. I stood up, unplugged my secured drive, and prepared my next surgical strike against the people who destroyed my trust. I sat back down in my leather chair, staring at the blank screen for a long moment, before plugging the encrypted hard drive back into the secure server tower. Finding Beatrice at the end of the Cayman Islands money trail was a massive victory, but a glaring mathematical discrepancy still gnawed at my fiercely analytical mind. Andre and Kendrick had siphoned millions from the corporate operational funds. Yes, but the timeline did not make logical sense. The tech startup simply had not generated enough initial liquid capital to fund a $3 million offshore trust so rapidly without instantly triggering catastrophic alarms from their venture capital investors. There had to be a massive, hidden injection of seed money that kickstarted the entire money laundering operation. I needed to uncover the exact origin of the initial deposit that funded Apex Holdings International. I pulled up the earliest transaction logs from the Miami clearinghouse, isolating the very first wire transfer that established the offshore account. The numbers glared back at me in bright neon green. $3 million had been moved in a single massive lump sum exactly 2 weeks before the ghost corporations began issuing their fake monthly invoices. That kind of heavy capital does not just magically appear out of thin air. It required institutional backing. I initiated a reverse trace on the origination routing number, bypassing the superficial banking layers and diving directly into the Federal Reserve wire transfer database. The digital breadcrumbs led me straight back to Atlanta, pointing directly to one of the most prominent commercial banks in the entire state of Georgia. Andre had secured a massive commercial loan. I tapped my fingernails against the mahogany desk, my mind calculating the sheer impossibility of that transaction. Commercial banks are notoriously ruthless when evaluating tech startups. They demand pristine audited financials, rock-solid revenue projections, and most importantly, tangible collateral. Andre possessed absolutely none of those things. His company was a house of cards built on inflated user metrics and empty promises. A conservative commercial bank would never hand a man like Andre $3 million in liquid cash based solely on his arrogant charm and a flimsy business plan. He had to have offered them something highly valuable, something physical, and something completely unencumbered by existing debt. I launched a targeted infiltration into the commercial bank's loan origination registry. I utilized a specialized backdoor access key I had acquired during a previous forensic investigation involving corrupt mortgage lenders. The security firewall barely registered my presence as I slipped into the heavily guarded digital vault holding the bank's active commercial loan portfolios. I cross-referenced Andre's corporate tax identification number with the $3 million disbursement record. The search query loaded instantly, pulling up a highly detailed 200-page commercial credit agreement. I split the massive document across my 3 monitors, rapidly scanning through the dense legal jargon, the exorbitant interest rate terms, and the aggressive repayment schedules Kendrick had foolishly agreed to. I bypassed the standard corporate guarantees and navigated straight to the collateral appendix. My eyes scanned the screen, searching for the specific physical asset Andre had pledged to secure the massive cash injection. When the bold black text finally appeared on my center monitor, all the air violently left my lungs. My entire body went completely rigid. A wave of pure, unadulterated fury washed over me, burning hotter than anything I had ever felt before. The collateral listed on the commercial loan agreement was my historic Buckhead estate. This was not just any piece of real estate. This sprawling, beautiful property was the absolute crown jewel of my family legacy. My late father had purchased the estate decades ago, working tirelessly to secure our place in one of the most exclusive and historically significant neighborhoods in Atlanta. It was a powerful symbol of Black excellence, a tangible manifestation of my father's blood, sweat, and relentless sacrifice. He had explicitly left the estate to me in his will, ensuring that I would always have a permanent sanctuary, regardless of what happened in my life. The property was entirely paid off, completely debt-free, and held exclusively in my maiden name. I had adamantly refused to add Andre's name to the deed when we got married, explicitly protecting my father's hard-earned legacy from my husband's erratic financial ambitions. Andre knew exactly how much that house meant to me. He knew it was the physical embodiment of my father's love and protection. Yet he had callously offered it up to a commercial bank to fund his illicit offshore enterprise. The sheer depravity of his actions took my breath away. He was not just stealing money. He was actively desecrating my family legacy to fund his mistresses, his luxury lifestyle, and his mother's insatiable greed. My mind raced to comprehend the legal mechanics of the transaction. The bank was incredibly thorough. They would never approve a multi-million-dollar loan using a property as collateral without the explicit notarized consent of the primary deed holder. Since my name was the only one on the official property deed, the bank would have absolutely required my physical signature on the master collateral agreement. They would have required my government-issued identification, my social security number, and my direct authorization to encumber the historic estate. I had never stepped foot inside that commercial bank. I had never spoken to their loan officers. I had never agreed to leverage my childhood home to fund Andre's technology startup. I frantically scrolled down to the very last page of the dense commercial credit agreement. I needed to see exactly how they managed to bypass the bank's rigorous underwriting security protocols. The screen rendered the final signature block displaying the heavily fortified legal execution page. I leaned in close to the glowing monitor, my eyes burning with intense, focused rage as I examined the high-resolution scanned image. There it was. My name was signed perfectly on the dotted line. I stared at the flawless loops and the distinctive slant of the ink. It was a masterful, absolutely impeccable forgery. Andre had lived with me for 8 years. He had watched me sign hundreds of tax returns, grocery receipts, and legal documents. He knew the exact pressure and rhythm of my handwriting. But Andre was too arrogant and impatient to execute something this meticulous on his own. This required the desperate, calculated precision of a man who spent his entire day manipulating financial documents. This was Kendrick's handiwork. Kendrick had spent weeks practicing my signature, perfecting every single curve and arch until it could easily pass a basic visual inspection by a rushed commercial loan officer. They had stolen my identity, forged my signature, and handed my father's legacy over to a ruthless commercial bank to secure $3 million in stolen cash. The terrifying reality of my legal predicament immediately crashed down on me. By forging my signature on the master collateral agreement, Andre and Kendrick had inextricably linked my personal financial ruin to their massive criminal conspiracy. They knew the tech startup could never actually repay the $3 million commercial loan. They never intended to repay it. Their entire strategy was deeply malicious and highly calculated. They planned to quietly funnel the $3 million to Beatrice's offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Then, during the messy, highly publicized divorce proceedings, Andre would officially declare his technology company completely bankrupt. He would show the divorce court a heavily manipulated ledger, proving the business was entirely broke, ensuring I received absolutely zero alimony or corporate equity. But the commercial bank would not simply walk away from a $3 million defaulted loan. When Andre's company inevitably failed to make the exorbitant monthly payments, the bank would aggressively trigger the collateral clause. They would initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings on the Buckhead estate. The bank would seize my childhood home, auction it off to the highest bidder, and leave me utterly homeless. I would be completely evicted from my father's historic property, publicly disgraced and legally saddled with a massive insurmountable debt that I never actually authorized. Andre and his toxic family had orchestrated a flawless, multi-layered trap designed to annihilate me. They intended to steal my money, destroy my professional reputation, obliterate my mental health, and rip away my childhood home. They wanted me to watch my father's historic legacy be forcefully auctioned off to wealthy strangers while they sat very comfortably in their massive suburban mansions, entirely funded by the stolen cash safely hidden away in Beatrice's tropical offshore bank account. I sat in the quiet darkness of my high-tech home office, staring intently at the final page of the loan agreement. The harsh, cold blue light from the 3 massive monitors washed over my face, illuminating the terrible reality of their ultimate betrayal. Andre and Kendrick had expertly forged my signature to secure the $3 million debt, placing my childhood home on the brink of foreclosure. Section 6, 1,500 words. I sat perfectly still in the chilling silence, slowly letting the sheer, terrifying magnitude of their complex criminal conspiracy wash completely over me. The entire blueprint of their malicious operation was now crystal clear, illuminated by the harsh, unrelenting glow of my 3 massive monitors. Andre and Kendrick had meticulously weaponized my own identity against me. They took out the massive commercial loan in my name, using my father's historic Buckhead estate as the ultimate sacrificial lamb. Then they systematically funneled that $3 million through their ridiculous network of domestic ghost corporations, layering transactions to confuse the banking auditors. Finally, they swept every single penny of that stolen cash into the Cayman Islands shell company, controlled exclusively by Beatrice. The timing of Andre's sudden demand for a divorce was not a coincidence. It was the final devastating phase of their carefully orchestrated timeline. He was actively preparing to declare corporate bankruptcy right in the middle of our divorce proceedings. He would walk into the courtroom, present his fabricated financial ledgers to the judge, and claim his real estate technology startup was completely destitute. He would strategically default on the commercial loan, fully knowing that the ruthless bank would immediately target the collateral. They wanted to ensure that I was legally saddled with a $3 million debt I could never repay on a standard auditor's salary. The bank would ruthlessly foreclose on my childhood home, auctioning off my father's proudest achievement to the highest bidder, leaving me completely homeless and financially ruined. Meanwhile, Andre Kendrick and Beatrice would be sitting comfortably on millions of dollars of untraceable offshore cash, entirely untouchable by the divorce court. The sheer depravity of their coordinated attack sickened me. They did not just want to end a marriage or secure a favorable financial settlement. They wanted absolute catastrophic annihilation. Beatrice wanted me erased from their elite Atlanta social circles forever, ensuring I could never expose her hypocritical facade. Vanessa and Kendrick wanted to fund their lavish lifestyle of designer clothes and luxury cars using my stolen credit. Andre wanted to punish me for knowing the truth about his profound mediocrity. He despised that I was the actual brains behind his initial success, deciding to destroy my life to protect his fragile ego. The Buckhead estate was not merely brick and mortar. It was the physical embodiment of my late father's lifelong dedication to our family. He had worked multiple jobs, faced brutal discrimination, and sacrificed his own health to purchase that home. He wanted me to have a permanent sanctuary in a world that constantly tries to tear Black women down. Andre knew the profound emotional weight that property carried for me. He knew how much I cherished the memories hidden within those walls. Yet he eagerly offered it up to a predatory commercial lender just to fund his narcissistic fantasies. His willingness to destroy my family legacy for his own selfish gain revealed a monstrous lack of basic human decency. For a brief fleeting moment, my hand hovered over my mobile phone. My initial instinct was to immediately call the Atlanta Police Department White-Collar Crime Division and hand over the encrypted hard drive. I had more than enough forensic evidence to trigger a massive federal raid on Andre's corporate headquarters by dawn. I could easily picture the heavily armed federal agents kicking down the glass doors of his startup, dragging him and Kendrick out in shiny silver handcuffs, while the local news crews filmed the entire humiliating spectacle. It would be a swift, brutal public reckoning. But my intensely analytical mind quickly overrides that emotional impulse. I played out the grueling reality of standard litigation. If I surrendered my evidence to law enforcement tonight, the criminal investigation would take several tedious years to crawl through the heavily backlogged justice system. Andre and Beatrice would instantly hire aggressive, high-priced defense attorneys using the stolen Cayman Islands funds. They would tie the case up in endless procedural delays, filing frivolous motions to suppress my forensic data. But the most terrifying factor was the commercial bank. The bank would not simply pause their aggressive foreclosure proceedings just because I claimed the master collateral agreement was a forgery. They would immediately freeze the Buckhead estate, placing my childhood home in a rigid legal limbo. I would be forced to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on my own legal representation just to fight the bank in civil court, desperately trying to prove my signature was faked. During that exhausting multi-year legal bloodbath, the bank could still seize the property. I could easily win the criminal fraud case against my ex-husband, but still lose my father's historic legacy to the bank in the process. Standard justice was far too slow, too messy, and far too risky. I could not afford to leave the fate of my father's estate in the hands of a sluggish judicial system or an apathetic commercial loan officer. I needed absolute, unassailable control over the entire situation. I needed to bypass the traditional legal route entirely and execute a much more ruthless, silent strategy. If I wanted to completely crush Andre Kendrick and Beatrice without jeopardizing my property, I could not just play the role of the victimized wife. I needed to become the ultimate authority in their financial lives. I needed to become the bank. The revelation hit me with the force of a freight train. The commercial bank holding Andre's fraudulent loan was a profit-driven institution. They did not care about family drama, forged signatures, or offshore money laundering. They only cared about minimizing their risk and maintaining their financial liquidity. If a highly credible, heavily capitalized private equity trust approached them with an offer to purchase a high-risk commercial debt at a slight premium, they would eagerly sell the paper and wash their hands of the entire liability. If my anonymous venture capital firm secretly purchased that specific $3 million loan portfolio from the commercial bank, the power dynamic would instantly permanently shift. The bank would no longer hold the collateral rights to the Buckhead estate. I would. I would legally own my ex-husband's massive debt. I would become the supreme, unquestionable dictator of his failing technology company. I could legally seize his corporate assets, demand immediate repayment, and hold the absolute authority to trigger the default clauses whenever I desired. I would hold Kendrick completely accountable for the forged documents, and I could use the debt to legally pierce the corporate veil of Beatrice's offshore shell company. It was a flawlessly devastating execution plan. It would completely blindside them in the middle of the divorce proceedings. But executing a hostile debt buyout of this magnitude required enormous, instantaneous liquid capital. I could not use my standard venture capital channels without leaving a noticeable digital footprint that Kendrick's automated monitoring software might accidentally flag. I needed $3 million of clean, untraceable cash, cleared by tomorrow morning. I pushed my chair back from the mahogany desk and stood up, pacing the length of my penthouse office. The glowing lights of the Atlanta skyline outside my floor-to-ceiling windows offered a stark reminder of the immense wealth and power concentrated in this city. I needed a ghost investor. I needed someone with unlimited resources who operated entirely outside the traditional banking grid, someone who trusted me implicitly and owed me a monumental favor. My mind instantly locked onto a single name. 2 years ago, I was quietly hired to conduct a massive forensic audit for an incredibly reclusive billionaire real estate magnate based in Chicago. He suspected his executive board was siphoning funds from his international development projects. I spent 4 grueling months dismantling their complex embezzlement ring, ultimately saving his empire over $40 million in stolen assets and keeping his company out of the federal spotlight. He had offered me a permanent executive position, which I politely declined, but he made a firm promise before we parted ways. He told me that if I ever found myself in a situation requiring absolute discretion and unlimited firepower, I only had to make one phone call. I walked to my secure wall safe, spun the combination dial, and retrieved a heavily encrypted satellite phone. It was a completely untraceable burner device isolated from commercial cellular towers. I punched in the private 12-digit international number he had provided me during our last confidential meeting. I stood silently in the center of the completely dark room, letting the silence wrap around me. I waited patiently in the dark, gripping the plastic device. Suddenly, the secure digital line clicked open with a sharp, distinct burst of static interference. A deep, "Oh," gravelly voice answered immediately, demanding to know who was calling on this restricted channel. I took one very slow, calculated deep breath, staring out over the bright, sleeping city of Atlanta, fully preparing to utterly destroy my ungrateful, treacherous husband once and for all. I told the billionaire that it was Naomi, and I was finally calling to collect my favor. Section 7. 1,500 words. The line was silent for a fraction of a second before a deep, rumbling chuckle vibrated through the encrypted speaker. He remembered me instantly. He did not ask how I acquired a secure satellite connection, nor did he offer trivial pleasantries. Men operating at his supreme level of international wealth appreciated absolute brevity above all else. He simply asked what specific damage I was looking to inflict tonight. I kept my explanation entirely clinical and ruthlessly precise. I told him I needed $3.5 million in clean, fully untraced liquid capital transferred into a newly established domestic blind trust before the commercial banking markets opened at 9 in the morning. I explained that I was executing a hostile debt buyout of a fraudulent tech startup and needed to move with overwhelming financial force to bypass standard banking bureaucracy. I offered to send my portfolio prospectus and draft a formal promissory note with an aggressive interest rate guaranteeing his return. He immediately cut me off. He stated that my word was the only collateral he would ever require, reminding me that my previous forensic audit had saved his global development firm from total collapse. He considered this massive capital injection a minor token of his enduring gratitude. He gave me a secure routing number, instructed me to forward the blind trust details, and promised the funds would be cleared and waiting before dawn. The connection terminated with a sharp click. I lowered the satellite phone, feeling a massive surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The financial counterattack was officially in motion. I moved back to my multi-monitor workstation, cracking my knuckles as I prepared to construct an impenetrable corporate fortress. Setting up a blind trust requires meticulous understanding of domestic corporate law, something I perfected during my years investigating shady hedge funds. I could not simply register a new liability company in Georgia. That would leave a distinct paper trail Kendrick might stumble upon if he ever learned to properly use his financial software. I needed absolute airtight anonymity. I routed my secure connection to the Delaware Corporate Registry. Delaware offered the most aggressive corporate privacy protections in the entire country, shielding the true beneficiaries of a trust behind heavy walls of administrative obscurity. Within 45 minutes, I had successfully drafted the foundational articles of incorporation for a brand new entity. I named it Obsidian Asset Management. The name sounded imposing, institutional, and entirely faceless. I structured Obsidian as a closed, blind trust, legally separating the managing director from the sole beneficiary. To serve as the public face of Obsidian, I utilized a specialized corporate proxy firm located in Wilmington. They provided a registered agent who would sign all the outward-facing documentation, ensuring my name never appeared on any public registries. I drafted a heavily fortified operating agreement designating myself as the sole anonymous beneficiary holding absolute executive authority over all acquired assets. Once the legal framework was perfectly established, I linked the fresh Delaware corporate accounts to the routing numbers provided by the billionaire. I watched the digital clock on my center monitor tick slowly toward morning. The Atlanta skyline outside my penthouse windows gradually shifted from pitch black to a soft, hazy blue. At exactly 6 in the morning, a bright green notification flashed across my screen. The international wire transfer had cleared the Federal Reserve System. $3.5 million now sat securely in the Obsidian Asset Management operational account. The capital was entirely clean, legally verified, and completely untraceable to my personal finances. I had the ultimate weapon fully loaded and ready to deploy. I took a scalding hot shower, changed into a sharp charcoal suit, and pulled my hair into a severe professional bun. I was no longer playing the role of the discarded, devastated wife. I was stepping into the arena as a ruthless venture capitalist, preparing to execute a hostile corporate takeover. At exactly 8:30, I initiated a secure recorded video conference call with my retained proxy attorney in Delaware. His name was Marcus, a brilliant and highly aggressive corporate lawyer who specialized in distressed asset acquisitions. I quickly briefed Marcus on the specific target. I instructed him to approach the commercial bank holding Andre's $3 million loan. I told Marcus to present Obsidian Asset Management as a highly capitalized private equity firm looking to acquire high-risk commercial tech debt. I gave him a strict, non-negotiable directive. He was to purchase the entire loan portfolio, including all master collateral agreements, and he was authorized to offer a significant premium to close the deal immediately. Marcus understood the assignment perfectly. He did not ask probing questions about the underlying family drama. He recognized a lucrative, ruthless corporate maneuver when he saw one. At exactly 9 in the morning, Marcus initiated contact with the Executive Risk Management Division of the commercial bank in Atlanta. I monitored the entire interaction through a secure audio relay, listening intently as Marcus flawlessly executed my strategy. He connected directly with the Senior Vice President of Commercial Lending. The bank executive initially sounded defensive, clearly surprised by the sudden, unprompted interest from a Delaware-based private equity firm. Marcus smoothly navigated the conversation, playing on the bank's institutional anxieties. He casually mentioned that Obsidian Asset Management specialized in acquiring distressed tech startup portfolios. He subtly highlighted the extreme volatility of the current real estate technology market, planting a sharp seed of doubt regarding Andre's long-term financial stability. Marcus noted that startups with unproven revenue models often defaulted within their first 36 months, forcing banks into lengthy, expensive foreclosure battles. The senior vice president remained quiet on the line, but I knew Marcus had struck a major nerve. Commercial banks despise holding high-risk tech debt. They loathe the messy public relations nightmare of foreclosing residential collateral. Andre was currently a massive ticking time bomb sitting directly on their balance sheet. They just did not realize how close to detonating he actually was. Marcus tightened the trap with brilliant precision. He offered the bank a highly lucrative, completely irresistible exit strategy. Obsidian Asset Management was prepared to purchase the entire $3 million loan portfolio immediately. Marcus stated that Obsidian would assume all the associated risks, all the corporate liabilities, and all the cumbersome administrative burdens. To eliminate any potential hesitation, Marcus offered a flat premium of $250,000 above the principal balance. He promised an immediate all-cash wire transfer that would clear their accounts by noon. The bank would instantly recognize a massive risk-free profit without having to endure a single day of messy foreclosure litigation. The audio relay went completely silent for several agonizing minutes. I sat rigidly at my desk, my eyes locked on the blinking green light of the encrypted audio channel. I knew the bank executives were hurriedly consulting their internal risk assessment algorithms. They were looking at Andre's inflated financial projections, recognizing the flimsy nature of his corporate guarantees, and comparing it against a guaranteed immediate cash payout from a highly liquid private equity firm. The math was undeniably heavily weighted in my favor. The senior vice president finally returned to the line. His voice had lost all its previous defensive posturing, replaced by a smooth, eager tone of corporate compliance. He stated that the bank was highly interested in finalizing the transfer of the debt portfolio to Obsidian Asset Management. Marcus wasted absolutely no time letting them reconsider their position. He immediately transmitted the dense pre-drafted assignment and assumption agreements directly to the bank's legal department. The digital paperwork legally transferred every single aspect of the commercial loan from the bank directly to my blind trust. This comprehensive transfer included the master promissory note, the corporate payment schedules, and most importantly, the exclusive enforcement rights to the collateralized Buckhead estate. The bank executives eagerly signed the digital contracts, completely thrilled to dump what they correctly perceived as a highly volatile asset. I watched my center monitor as the official wire transfer initiated. $3,250,000 seamlessly vanished from the Obsidian account and landed squarely in the commercial bank's primary ledger. The massive transaction completely finalized with a sharp, definitive digital chime echoing loudly through my quiet office. The confirmation receipt materialized on my screen, verifying the absolute transfer of power. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, a slow, incredibly dark, and deeply satisfying smile spreading completely across my face as I meticulously analyzed the fully executed legal documents. The commercial bank was now officially and entirely out of the complex financial picture forever. Andre and Kendrick no longer owed their massive, extremely fraudulent commercial debt to a completely faceless, highly bureaucratic financial institution. Using her supreme financial leverage and limitless liquid capital, Naomi's powerful blind trust successfully purchased the fraudulent debt directly from the commercial bank at a massive premium, totally sealing their ultimate inescapable fate forever. I was now the absolute, unquestionable owner of Andre's massive commercial debt. The legal trap had snapped completely shut off screen, securely locking my ex-husband and his treacherous family inside a fortified financial cage they could not even see yet. By holding the master promissory note through Obsidian Asset Management, I possessed the ultimate, unassailable leverage over every single aspect of their miserable lives. I controlled the immediate fate of his bloated real estate technology company. I held the absolute power to legally crush Kendrick's entire professional career as a chief financial officer. I possessed the direct legal authority to pierce the corporate veil of Beatrice's offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. Most importantly, I had successfully shielded my father's historic Buckhead estate from any predatory commercial bank foreclosure. The property was safe, firmly anchored under my complete jurisdiction. I closed the banking portal and allowed myself a brief moment of profound satisfaction. I had effectively checkmated them before they even realized a game was being played. While I sat in the quiet power of my penthouse office, my antagonists were busy aggressively celebrating their fabricated victory across town. They were entirely convinced that their malicious plot had worked flawlessly. They believed they had successfully left me destitute, humiliated, and utterly broken. I opened a separate monitor and ran a quick scan across their public social media profiles. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance radiating from their digital footprint was absolutely staggering. Vanessa was the loudest and most obnoxious of them all. Her social media feed was suddenly flooded with high-resolution photos and obnoxious videos flaunting a massive influx of brand-new designer items. She posted a detailed unboxing video of a rare, imported leather handbag that cost more than a standard luxury vehicle. She followed it up with a mirror selfie showcasing diamond-encrusted stilettos, adding a toxic, thinly veiled caption about how some women are just born to experience the absolute finest things in life, while others are destined to remain at the bottom of the food chain. She tagged the luxury boutiques in Buckhead, proudly displaying her location to her thousands of followers. Vanessa was blissfully unaware that every single expensive item she flaunted was purchased using the heavily laundered corporate funds Kendrick had brazenly stolen from Andre's company. She was wearing federal wire fraud on her wrist and strutting around in grand larceny. Kendrick appeared in the background of one of her videos wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit, holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch and looking incredibly smug. He had the distinct, arrogant posture of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room. He thought he had outsmarted a commercial bank, outsmarted his arrogant brother-in-law, and completely ruined a top-tier financial auditor. He thought he was untouchable. Andre was equally repulsive in his public displays of stolen wealth. He posted a carefully curated photo from a highly exclusive rooftop restaurant in Midtown Atlanta. He was sitting across from Sienna, his new public relations director, proposing a toast to incredibly bright new beginnings and massive corporate expansion. He wore a brand new luxury watch that gleamed under the ambient restaurant lighting. He was publicly celebrating the brutal execution of our 8-year marriage entirely funded by the phantom cash he believed was safely hidden in the Caribbean. Beatrice was not absent from the digital victory lap either. The official social media page for our elite megachurch posted a glowing 10-minute video tribute to her incredible generosity. Beatrice had apparently just donated a massive, highly publicized sum of cash to the church building fund. She stood at the pulpit wearing a brand new designer suit, humbly accepting the thunderous applause of the blind congregation while the head pastor praised her unmatched moral character. She was actively using the stolen offshore money to purchase an untouchable layer of holy armor within the Atlanta community. I watched their grotesque celebrations with absolute icy detachment. I did not feel a single ounce of jealousy or anger. I only felt the cold, analytical focus of a predator watching its prey blindly wander straight into a carefully laid trap. They were aggressively spending the stolen operational funds, leaving a massive, highly documented trail of digital evidence across social media platforms and luxury retail networks. They were building my entire legal case for me, publicly documenting their sudden, inexplicable wealth right before a highly contested divorce hearing. I decided to pivot my intense forensic focus away from the massive corporate structure and zero in directly on Kendrick. As the chief financial officer executing the actual money laundering logistics, Kendrick was the weakest, sloppiest link in their entire criminal chain. He lacked the cold discipline required to manage a long-term financial crime without skimming a little extra off the top for his own personal entertainment. He was an arrogant man, given a massive amount of unmonitored power. And arrogant men always make fatal mistakes when they believe nobody is watching their private transactions. I booted up a specialized tracking protocol designed specifically to monitor secondary banking nodes. When Kendrick split the stolen operational funds into smaller increments to funnel them out of the country, he had to use a highly complex network of digital routing accounts. I combed through the specific placement and layering sequences he executed during the previous 2 months. I was searching for the tiny, almost imperceptible leaks in his fraudulent pipeline. I meticulously matched the outbound domestic wires against the inbound offshore deposits. The numbers were massive, but they did not align perfectly. There was a consistent recurring discrepancy in his overall mathematical structure. Every single time Kendrick initiated a transfer to the ghost corporations, a small, highly specific percentage of the cash never actually made it to the Miami clearinghouse. He was quietly skimming roughly 4% of the stolen corporate funds and diverting them into a completely separate, heavily hidden domestic account. He was actively stealing from Andre's stolen money. I cracked my knuckles and launched a brutal, targeted assault on that hidden domestic routing number. I bypassed the standard banking security barriers using a heavily encrypted backdoor portal. The hidden account belonged to a domestic shell company registered under a completely different name, but the authorized signer was unmistakably Kendrick. I pulled the detailed transaction history for the past 6 months, downloading the raw data directly to my secure server. I opened the ledger and began analyzing the specific outbound expenditures. The spending patterns were instantly revealing. Kendrick was not using this skimmed cash to fund Vanessa's lavish designer handbag collection. The transaction dates and merchant locations did not match Vanessa's highly publicized social media timeline at all. Instead, the money was being aggressively spent at high-end boutiques, exclusive day spas, and luxury jewelers that Vanessa never frequented. I isolated a cluster of massive transactions that occurred 3 weeks ago. Kendrick had spent over $15,000 at a highly exclusive diamond importer located in the wealthy Buckhead shopping district. The very next day, Vanessa had complained loudly in the family group chat about Kendrick forgetting their wedding anniversary. She definitely did not receive a $15,000 piece of jewelry. I dug deeper into the hidden ledger cross-referencing the dates of his purported late-night corporate strategy meetings with Andre. The digital paper trail was absolutely devastating. On the exact nights Kendrick claimed to be locked in the corporate boardroom finalizing the quarterly financial projections, his hidden account showed massive charges at a highly discreet, ultra-luxury boutique hotel located just outside the Atlanta city limits. He was routinely booking the most expensive penthouse suite available. The hotel receipts included exorbitant charges for premium room service, expensive imported champagne, and late-night couples spa treatments. I pulled the detailed itemized folios directly from the boutique hotel's insecure digital archive. The booking name was an incredibly lazy alias, but the credit card utilized for the incidental charges was tied directly to his hidden domestic shell account. The room service receipts clearly indicated meals ordered for 2 people. Kendrick was not working late. He was not grinding over complex financial spreadsheets to save Andre's failing technology company. He was aggressively funding a highly expensive, extremely active secret life entirely behind Vanessa's back. I ran a quick cross-reference on the authorized secondary guests listed on his luxury hotel bookings. The names staring back at me on the high-resolution screen made me let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed loudly through my quiet penthouse office. Kendrick was not just cheating on his incredibly arrogant, highly materialistic wife. He was carrying on a long-term, highly expensive affair with the very same public relations director who had proudly taken my seat at the corporate anniversary gala. He was deeply entangled with Sienna. The sheer level of absolute dysfunction and betrayal running rampant through their inner circle was staggering. Kendrick was actively stealing from Andre to buy diamond jewelry and luxury hotel suites for Andre's own mistress. They were all lying to each other, stealing from each other, and actively destroying each other while foolishly believing they were a united front against me. I pressed my fingers against the keyboard, quickly downloading every single high-resolution hotel receipt, every luxury jewelry invoice, and the complete transaction history of Kendrick's hidden domestic account. I secured the massive data packet onto my heavily encrypted external hard drive right next to the Cayman Islands incorporation documents. I secured the final piece of leverage to destroy Vanessa and Kendrick's marriage. The digital vault in my penthouse office held every single document required to completely annihilate my ex-husband and his entire parasitic family. I unplugged the heavily encrypted external hard drive from the secure server tower and slipped it carefully into the inner pocket of my leather portfolio. Today was the day of the mandatory pre-trial mediation. The state of Georgia required this highly tedious legal step before any divorce could officially proceed to a final courtroom hearing before a judge. It was a formal opportunity for both parties to lay their financial cards on the table and attempt to reach a mutual settlement. I knew Andre was fully expecting me to walk into that room completely broken, desperately seeking whatever miserable scraps he decided to toss my way. I dressed with meticulous intention. I bypassed the aggressive power suits in my closet and selected a modest, unassuming beige skirt and a plain white blouse. I wore absolutely no jewelry. I tied my hair back into a simple, unadorned knot. I needed to look exactly like the defeated, financially ruined woman they all believed I was. I wanted them to feel overwhelmingly confident and incredibly arrogant. Overconfidence always breeds fatal mistakes, and I needed them to firmly commit to their massive lies on the official legal record. I drove my modest sedan into the heart of downtown Atlanta. The towering glass skyscrapers reflected the bright morning sun, casting long, sharp shadows across the busy city streets. I pulled into the underground parking garage of a highly prestigious, ultra-luxury corporate law firm. Andre had hired one of the most ruthless, heavily overpriced defense attorneys in the entire state. He was aggressively using the stolen operational funds from his technology startup to finance a legal team designed specifically to intimidate and crush me. I stepped into the private elevator and rode it up to the 50th floor. The heavy glass doors slid open to reveal a massive, pristine reception area featuring imported Italian marble floors and panoramic views of the sprawling city. The receptionist offered me a polite, tightly practiced smile and immediately escorted me down a long, quiet corridor. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the primary executive conference room. I stepped quietly over the threshold and walked inside alone. The sheer level of absolute arrogance radiating across the large mahogany table was entirely suffocating. They had brought the entire toxic family to the mediation as a deliberate psychological intimidation tactic. Andre sat at the very head of the table, flanked heavily by his expensive corporate attorney. Beatrice sat perfectly upright to his immediate right, while Vanessa and Kendrick occupied the plush leather chairs on his left. They looked like they were attending a high society gala rather than a grim legal proceeding. Every single one of them was draped heavily in brand new, incredibly expensive designer fashion. Vanessa was openly wearing a massive diamond tennis bracelet that I knew for a fact was purchased using the stolen offshore money. She held a rare limited edition imported leather handbag tightly in her lap. Beatrice wore a pristine custom-tailored white suit with a matching silk scarf projecting the absolute image of wealthy, untouchable church royalty. Kendrick wore a highly flashy, custom-fitted pinstripe suit, completely oblivious to the fact that I held the digital receipts for every single luxury hotel room he had booked for Andre's public relations director. Andre leaned back in his expensive leather chair, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. He wore a brand new, highly exclusive imported watch that gleamed under the bright conference room lights. He looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disdain. His eyes swept over my plain beige skirt and simple white blouse, and a cold, mocking smirk instantly spread across his face. He nudged his attorney and whispered something quietly, causing the lawyer to let out a low, arrogant chuckle. Vanessa did not even attempt to hide her absolute contempt. She leaned across the polished table, her eyes glaring directly into mine. She loudly told me that I looked completely exhausted and incredibly cheap. She openly mocked my decision to show up to a high-stakes legal meeting without bringing an expensive defense attorney. She called me a pathetic, stubborn woman who was about to lose absolutely everything because I was too stupid to understand how real wealth actually operated. Beatrice quickly joined the coordinated verbal assault. She dramatically sighed, placing her manicured hand over her heart in a gesture of completely fabricated pity. She told me that she had prayed heavily for my fractured mental health during the Sunday church service. She loudly stated that my refusal to graciously accept the end of my marriage was a clear sign of deep spiritual sickness. She told me that God was punishing me for my overwhelming greed and my total lack of submission to my successful husband. Kendrick sat quietly next to his wife, but his body language was incredibly loud. He stared at me with a deeply smug, highly superior expression. He casually tapped his expensive fountain pen against the table, silently reveling in the massive financial crime he believed he had successfully executed against me. He thought he was a brilliant financial mastermind. He had absolutely no idea that I held the digital key to his imminent federal prison sentence safely tucked inside my leather portfolio. I pulled out one of the heavy leather chairs and sat down quietly on the opposite side of the massive mahogany table. I did not respond to Vanessa's cruel mockery. I did not acknowledge Beatrice's twisted religious gaslighting. I simply placed my hands on the table, looked directly at Andres' expensive attorney, and stated that I was ready to begin the mediation process. The lawyer offered a highly condescending smile, opened his thick leather briefcase, and pulled out a massive stack of freshly printed financial documents. He slid the heavy packet across the polished wood table until it rested directly in front of me. He cleared his throat loudly and began his heavily rehearsed, completely fabricated legal presentation. He stated that the financial realities of Andres Real Estate Technology Company were incredibly grim. He painted a highly detailed, entirely fictional picture of massive corporate losses, severe market downturns, and total financial devastation. The lawyer aggressively pointed to the thick stack of papers resting in front of me. He loudly claimed that the company possessed absolutely zero liquidity and held no tangible assets of any real value. He stated that Andre was currently living entirely on the gracious charity of his loving mother, Beatrice, because his executive salary had been completely suspended due to the massive corporate deficit. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. I knew for an absolute fact that $3 million of stolen operational funds were currently resting safely in Beatrice's secret offshore bank account in the Cayman Islands. Yet here they were, boldly submitting entirely fraudulent financial disclosures to an official legal proceeding. They were actively committing blatant perjury and profound fraud directly in front of me. The attorney then shifted his aggressive tone, adopting a deeply serious, highly threatening posture. He flipped to a specific page in the fabricated financial disclosure and pointed a sharp finger at a massive negative number printed in bold red ink. He loudly announced that the real estate technology company had recently defaulted on a massive $3 million commercial loan. He stated that the commercial bank was currently incredibly aggressive and looking to immediately collect on the outstanding debt. He paused dramatically, letting the heavy silence fill the tense conference room, before delivering what he believed was the ultimate, absolutely crushing blow. He stated that because my signature was prominently featured on the master collateral agreement, the bank was actively preparing to target my personal assets. Andre finally leaned forward, dropping his facade of silent boredom. He placed both his hands firmly on the table and stared directly into my eyes. His voice was cold, ruthless, and filled with absolute malice. He told me that my entire life was completely ruined. He explicitly stated that if I decided to fight him in divorce court, he would legally force me to assume 50% of the massive $3 million commercial debt. He threatened that the ruthless commercial bank would instantly foreclose on the historic Buckhead estate my late father had left me. He promised to drag the vicious legal battle out for years until the bank seized my childhood home, auctioned it off to the highest bidder, and left me completely homeless, utterly destitute, and drowning in insurmountable financial ruin. He wanted me to feel utterly trapped and completely terrified. Beatrice chimed in immediately, adding her own layer of toxic manipulation to the aggressive threat. She leaned across the table and told me that I should be incredibly grateful that her son was even willing to sit in the same room with me. She stated that my stubborn refusal to walk away quietly was deeply embarrassing for everyone involved. She told me to accept reality, surrender my childish pride, and take whatever small blessing Andre was generous enough to offer. She claimed that a smart woman would know exactly when she had been completely defeated. Andre reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a sleek leather-bound checkbook and a heavy silver pen. He slowly and deliberately wrote out a single check. He tore the small slip of paper from the binding and slid it all the way across the long mahogany table until it stopped directly in front of my hands. He loudly called it a charity severance. It was a check made out to me for exactly $10,000. He told me to take the miserable cash and use it to rent a cheap tiny apartment in a bad neighborhood far away from his elite social circle. He explicitly threatened that if I refused to accept this final offer and dared to show up in a courtroom, he would unleash his legal team and leave me holding the massive $3 million house debt forever. He demanded I take the check and disappear from his life permanently. I looked down at the small piece of paper resting on the polished wood. I slowly lifted my gaze and looked at every single person sitting across from me. I looked at Vanessa's greedy eyes. I looked at Kendrick's smug, cheating face. I looked at Beatrice's hypocritical glare. I looked directly into Andre's deeply arrogant, completely clueless eyes. I thought about my blind trust, the Cayman accounts, the bought debt, and the mistress receipts resting safely in my portfolio. I smiled icily, pushed my chair back, and stood up. I left the check sitting untouched on the table. I looked Andre dead in the eye and stated my final answer loudly. I will see you in court. The morning of the final divorce hearing arrived with a heavy, oppressive humidity that blanketed the city of Atlanta. The sky above the towering downtown courthouse was a pale, unforgiving gray, perfectly mirroring the cold and calculated reality of the legal battle that was about to unfold inside. I stepped out of my modest sedan and stood at the base of the massive concrete steps. The imposing architecture of the judicial building was designed to intimidate, to make ordinary people feel incredibly small and entirely powerless against the crushing weight of the legal system. But I did not feel small today. I felt like an absolute titan. I was wearing a sharply tailored, dark charcoal business suit. My hair was pulled back into a flawless tight chignon. I carried absolutely no briefcase, no thick binders, and no frantic legal pads. I held nothing in my hands except a single pristine white sealed envelope. Inside that thin paper casing rested the complete destruction of my ex-husband and his entire toxic family. I walked up the wide concrete steps with the steady measured pace of an executioner ascending the scaffold. I passed through the heavy metal detectors and navigated the crowded, echoing hallways of the family court division. Desperate couples argued in hushed tones outside various courtrooms, flanked by stressed attorneys holding overflowing briefcases. I ignored the chaotic noise around me and walked with absolute purpose toward courtroom 4. This was the domain of Judge Harrison, a veteran jurist renowned throughout the Atlanta legal community for his razor-sharp intellect and his absolute intolerance for courtroom theatrics. I pushed open the heavy wooden double doors and stepped into the quiet, highly polished space. The air conditioning hummed loudly, chilling the room to a sterile temperature. The courtroom was almost entirely empty, except for the opposing party, who had clearly arrived early to claim their territory and project an image of absolute dominance. Andre sat at the primary petitioner's table, looking like he was attending a luxury magazine photo shoot rather than a divorce hearing. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue Italian suit that cost more than a reliable used car. His posture was incredibly relaxed, his shoulders rolled back, and his legs casually crossed. He exuded a level of pure, unadulterated arrogance that bordered on comical. Beside him sat his highly expensive corporate attorney, a man whose expensive silk tie and aggressive demeanor screamed predatory billing hours. The lawyer was busy organizing a massive, intimidating fortress of thick legal binders and color-coded financial ledgers on the wooden table. When Andre saw me walk through the swinging wooden doors holding nothing but a single envelope, a wide, deeply mocking sneer spread completely across his handsome face. He leaned over and whispered something to his attorney. The lawyer looked at my empty hands, let out a short, dismissive laugh, and shook his head as if he were looking at a completely delusional, utterly defenseless woman walking willingly into a slaughterhouse. They were absolutely convinced I was committing legal suicide by showing up without aggressive legal representation. They firmly believed that my lack of an attorney proved I was entirely broken, totally destitute, and completely incapable of fighting back against their massive corporate resources. I ignored their smug laughter and walked past the wooden partition, taking my seat alone at the respondent's table. I placed my single sealed envelope gently on the smooth wooden surface in front of me and folded my hands patiently in my lap. I did not need a loud, expensive attorney to fight this battle for me. I was armed with the absolute, undeniable truth and an unlimited supply of hidden financial leverage. The gallery directly behind Andre was fully occupied by his loyal, toxic cheering section. Beatrice sat in the very front row of the spectator benches, positioning herself perfectly so she could be clearly seen by the judge when he eventually took the bench. She wore a modest but undeniably expensive pastel suit, clutching a leather-bound Bible in her lap. She was already playing the role of the deeply concerned, highly religious matriarch praying for her victimized son. Vanessa sat right next to her, tapping away on her latest flagship smartphone, her wrist weighed down by the massive diamond tennis bracelet Kendrick had purchased using stolen corporate funds. I could hear their aggressive, theatrical whispering echoing loudly through the quiet courtroom. Beatrice leaned toward Vanessa and loudly remarked that it was a total disgrace for a woman to show up to a courtroom looking so plain and unprepared. Vanessa snickered and loudly agreed, stating that I probably could not even afford a basic consultation fee for a cheap public defender. Kendrick sat on the other side of Vanessa wearing a flashy designer watch and checking his manicured cuticles with deep boredom. He looked entirely unbothered by the heavy legal atmosphere. He thought his offshore money laundering tracks were perfectly covered. He believed his secret luxury hotel rendezvous with Sienna were completely untraceable. He had no idea that I had spent the last week meticulously archiving every single one of his fraudulent wire transfers and every single one of his highly incriminating room service receipts. I looked at Kendrick over my shoulder for a brief fraction of a second. I offered him a very small, completely unreadable smile. He frowned slightly, shifting uncomfortably in his expensive suit, briefly sensing a tiny shift in the atmospheric pressure, but lacking the intellectual capacity to understand what it actually meant. I turned my attention back to the front of the room, just as the heavy wooden door behind the judicial bench suddenly clicked open. The bailiff, a towering, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform, stepped out and loudly ordered the entire courtroom to rise. We all stood in absolute silence as Judge Harrison strode purposefully into the room. He was a tall, distinguished African-American man with sharp, discerning eyes and a demeanor that commanded immediate absolute respect. His black judicial robes billowed slightly as he climbed the steps and took his seat behind the massive elevated bench. He placed a thick stack of manila folders down in front of him, adjusted his reading glasses, and stared down at the courtroom with a look of intense clinical scrutiny. The bailiff instructed us to be seated. The heavy silence in the room was palpable, thick with anticipation and underlying malice. Judge Harrison opened the topmost file and read the case number aloud, officially calling the dissolution of marriage between Andre and Naomi to the active legal record. He looked directly at Andre's expensive attorney first, giving a curt professional nod. Then his sharp gaze shifted across the aisle and landed squarely on me. He noted for the official court record that the respondent, Naomi, was appearing pro se, meaning I was acting as my own legal counsel without professional representation. He asked me directly if I fully understood the severe legal risks of representing myself in a highly complex, heavily contested financial divorce hearing. I stood up straight, looked him respectfully in the eye, and stated clearly and confidently that I fully understood my rights and was entirely prepared to proceed without external counsel. Andre let out a loud, highly dramatic sigh of annoyance, clearly wanting the judge to note how unreasonable and stubborn I was being. Judge Harrison did not acknowledge Andre's theatrical sigh. He folded his hands together and leaned forward, addressing the entire room. He stated that he had reviewed the preliminary mediation notes filed by the petitioner's legal team earlier that week. He noted that the mediation had completely failed to produce a mutual settlement. He then demanded to see the finalized, sworn financial disclosures from both parties. He explicitly stated that this court would not tolerate any hidden assets, any misleading corporate valuations, or any bad faith negotiations. He warned that any party found committing perjury regarding their financial standing would face immediate severe judicial sanctions. I maintained my perfectly neutral expression, keeping my hands resting lightly near my sealed envelope. Andre's attorney eagerly jumped to his feet, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced, highly dramatic flair. He thanked the judge and immediately launched into a deeply passionate, entirely fabricated opening statement. The lawyer paced slowly back and forth in front of the petitioner's table, using broad hand gestures to emphasize his completely fictional narrative. He began by painting Andre as a brilliant but incredibly unlucky entrepreneur who had fallen victim to an unforeseeable catastrophic collapse in the real estate technology sector. He stated that his client had poured his entire life savings, his blood and his sweat into building a company that was now completely devoid of liquidity. The attorney spoke with the smooth, polished cadence of a seasoned con artist. The lawyer boldly claimed that Andre's startup was currently operating at a massive, unsustainable deficit. He stated that all venture capital funding had completely dried up, leaving his client entirely unable to draw even a basic executive salary. He gestured sympathetically toward the gallery, specifically pointing out Beatrice. He told the judge that his client was currently enduring the ultimate humiliation of living in his mother's guest bedroom, relying entirely on her gracious charity, just to afford daily meals and basic transportation. The lawyer claimed that Andre possessed absolutely no hidden wealth, no offshore accounts, and no tangible corporate assets of any real value. He stated that the marriage had broken down simply because the intense financial stress had become too much for the couple to bear. The sheer audacity of the performance was genuinely impressive. They had rehearsed this exact sequence down to the very last dramatic pause. The lawyer then shifted his tone from sympathetic to aggressively accusatory. He turned to face me, directly pointing a sharp, accusing finger in my direction. He told the judge that while his client was desperately trying to save the failing company from total ruin, I had selfishly refused to contribute a single dollar to the marital enterprise. He falsely claimed that I had hoarded my own personal income, intentionally drained their joint emergency savings accounts, and stubbornly refused to support my husband during his darkest professional hour. He was actively projecting every single one of Andre's malicious actions directly onto me, executing a flawless courtroom-level gaslighting campaign on the official legal record. The attorney then stepped directly in front of the judge's elevated bench, lowering his voice into a serious, highly urgent register. He presented his final, most devastating fabricated claim. He stated that in a desperate final attempt to save the failing company, his client was forced to take out a massive commercial loan. He stated that this loan was taken out in total good faith, meant entirely to benefit the marital estate. He then dramatically revealed that the company had completely defaulted on this massive obligation. He loudly announced to the courtroom that the outstanding debt currently totaled exactly $3 million. The lawyer paused, letting the massive financial figure echo loudly off the wood-paneled walls. He then delivered the ultimate, deeply malicious demand. He stated that because this crushing debt was acquired during the course of the marriage, and because my signature was prominently featured on the master collateral agreement, the financial burden must be shared equally. He formally and aggressively demanded that the court order Naomi to legally assume 50% of the $3 million commercial debt. He demanded that my childhood home, the historic Buckhead estate, be immediately surrendered to the bank to satisfy the outstanding corporate liability. He concluded his dramatic plea by stating that this was the only fair, equitable, and legally sound resolution to this deeply unfortunate financial tragedy. Andre leaned back in his chair, a look of absolute predatory victory shining brightly in his eyes. Beatrice let out a loud, highly theatrical sigh of relief from the gallery, loudly whispering an amen for the entire room to hear. They firmly believed they had just successfully executed my complete financial execution on the official legal record. I did not flinch. I did not show a single ounce of fear, panic, or hesitation. I stood up slowly from my chair, the movement completely calm and entirely deliberate. I picked up the pristine white envelope resting on the polished wooden table. I bypassed the lawyers, ridiculous theatrics, entirely walked directly toward the center of the room, and handed the single sealed envelope to the armed bailiff to pass directly up to Judge Harrison. The heavy silence in the courtroom amplified the crisp sound of my leather heels against the polished floor as I returned to the respondent's table. The armed bailiff took the pristine white envelope from my outstretched hand, his face completely devoid of any emotion, and carried it up the short flight of wooden steps to the elevated judicial bench. He handed it directly to Judge Harrison. The judge took the envelope, pausing for a fraction of a second to examine the completely blank exterior before sliding his silver letter opener beneath the flap. The sharp tearing sound of the thick paper being sliced open echoed loudly through the silent, cavernous room. Andre leaned back in his chair, whispering something highly arrogant to his expensive attorney, fully convinced that whatever document I had just submitted was merely a desperate, utterly pathetic plea for financial mercy. Beatrice shifted loudly in the wooden gallery pews behind him, letting out a heavy theatrical sigh of absolute boredom. Judge Harrison pulled the thick stack of heavily encrypted financial documents from the envelope. These were not handwritten pleas or emotional declarations. These were the certified, legally binding assignment and assumption agreements executed directly between the commercial bank and Obsidian Asset Management. They were accompanied by a highly detailed, notarized summary of the complete chain of title for the $3 million commercial debt. The judge placed the paperwork flat on his massive mahogany desk and adjusted his reading glasses. He leaned forward, his sharp eyes scanning the first page of the complex legal filing. For several long, agonizing seconds, the entire courtroom remained suspended in absolute stillness. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic ticking of the antique clock hanging on the back wall and the low hum of the central air conditioning unit. Then something completely unprecedented happened. Judge Harrison, a veteran jurist renowned throughout the entire state of Georgia for his incredibly stoic, relentlessly clinical courtroom demeanor, suddenly let out a loud, booming laugh. It was not a small chuckle or a polite clearing of the throat. It was a deep, resonating laugh of pure, unadulterated astonishment that completely shattered the tense atmosphere of the courtroom. The sound bounced forcefully off the dark wood-paneled walls, causing every single person in the room to freeze in absolute shock. Andre's smug smirk instantly vanished, completely wiped from his handsome face as if he had been physically struck. His expensive corporate attorney jerked upright in his chair, his eyes darting frantically between the laughing judge and the stack of documents resting on the elevated bench. In the gallery, Beatrice's theatrical sighs abruptly stopped. Vanessa dropped her flagship smartphone into her lap, her jaw falling slack in total confusion. Kendrick sat up completely straight, his false confidence suddenly evaporating into thin air. Judge Harrison quickly composed himself, though a sharp, highly amused glint remained permanently fixed in his dark eyes. He took a deep breath, shook his head in absolute disbelief, and carefully laid his hands flat over the submitted documents. He looked directly down at the petitioner's table, his gaze locking intensely onto my ex-husband. The judicial authority radiating from the bench was absolutely palpable, thick with the promise of an imminent catastrophic reckoning. He addressed Andre directly, his voice echoing with absolute command. He asked the petitioner to stand up and verbally confirm the highly specific financial claims his legal counsel had just presented to the court. Andre swallowed hard, visibly unnerved by the judge's sudden shift in demeanor. He stood up slowly, shooting a desperate, confused glance at his attorney. The lawyer gave him a curt nod, signaling him to stick firmly to the fabricated narrative they had meticulously rehearsed. Andre buttoned his custom-tailored Italian suit jacket, lifted his chin, and stared back at the judge with a heavy layer of forced, arrogant confidence. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his voice completely devoid of any previous amusement. He stated that he wanted to be absolutely clear for the official court record before he made any final rulings regarding the division of marital assets. He asked Andre to explicitly confirm that his real estate technology startup had taken out a commercial loan totaling exactly $3 million. Andre stood tall, puffing out his chest, and stated clearly into the microphone that yes, his company had secured that massive commercial debt. He claimed he did it solely to keep the struggling enterprise afloat during a severely difficult financial quarter. The judge nodded slowly, making a deliberate note on his legal pad. He then asked Andre to confirm that the company was currently operating at a massive deficit, possessed absolutely zero liquid capital, and had completely defaulted on the monthly payments for this specific commercial loan. Andre did not hesitate for a single second. He looked incredibly proud of his own fabricated destitution. He boldly stated under oath that his business was entirely broke, heavily overdrawn, and facing imminent bankruptcy. He aggressively repeated his earlier lie, claiming he was currently living entirely off the gracious charity of his loving mother because he could not even afford a basic apartment in Atlanta. Judge Harrison did not flinch. He picked up his pen and tapped it rhythmically against the stack of papers I had provided. He asked the most critical question of the entire hearing. He demanded that Andre confirm, under the penalty of severe federal perjury, that he was actively requesting this court to legally force his ex-wife to assume 50% of that $3 million commercial debt. The judge explicitly asked Andre to confirm that he wanted the court to surrender the historic Buckhead estate, a property solely deeded in Naomi's name, directly to the commercial bank, to satisfy the outstanding corporate liability. Andre stared directly at me across the aisle, his eyes burning with intense predatory malice. He fully believed he was delivering the final fatal blow to my entire existence. He gripped the edges of the wooden table tightly, leaned into his microphone, and confidently committed absolute undeniable perjury on the official legal record. He stated loudly and aggressively that I was entirely responsible for the financial ruin of his company because I had selfishly refused to support his entrepreneurial vision. He demanded that I be forced to pay back the massive loan. He explicitly demanded that my childhood home be seized, auctioned off, and liquidated to cover his corporate failures. He declared that it was the only legally fair outcome for my total lack of submission and financial contribution to the marriage. His attorney nodded vigorously in agreement, completely oblivious to the massive trap that had just slammed shut around his client's neck. In the gallery, Beatrice loudly praised the Lord, clapping her hands together in a twisted display of religious validation. Vanessa smirked, leaning over to whisper something cruel to Kendrick, who was busy adjusting his flashy designer watch, completely unbothered by the fact that he had personally forged the signature on the very loan they were discussing. They were all aggressively celebrating their perceived victory, entirely convinced that the judge was simply verifying the details before ruling heavily in their favor. They had absolutely no idea that I had just successfully baited Andre into permanently destroying his own life on a recorded judicial transcript. He had just legally sworn under oath to the existence of a fraudulent debt, actively demanding I pay a commercial bank that no longer even held the promissory note. He had locked himself into a perjury charge so airtight that no expensive defense attorney in the state of Georgia could ever possibly unravel it. Judge Harrison sat in total silence for several long, agonizing moments. He allowed Andre's incredibly arrogant demands to hang heavily in the cold, sterile air of the courtroom. The judge looked at the completely fabricated financial ledgers submitted by Andre's attorney, and then he looked back down at the certified notarized corporate takeover documents I had handed him. The contrast between their pathetic, desperate lies and my absolute undeniable financial supremacy was stark and completely undeniable. The judge picked up the assignment and assumption agreement from Obsidian Asset Management. He held the document up slightly, allowing the bright overhead lights to illuminate the heavy, embossed corporate seals, verifying the multi-million-dollar transaction. He looked down at Andre, who was still standing proudly at the petitioner's table, waiting eagerly for the judge to hand down the final ruling that would strip me of my family legacy forever. Judge Harrison slowly removed his reading glasses, folding the arms with a sharp, definitive click that echoed loudly through the silent room. He placed the glasses deliberately on the mahogany bench, completely shattering the remaining tension with an aura of absolute terrifying judicial authority. He looked directly into Andre's confused, arrogant eyes, his voice booming with the undeniable force of absolute ruin. He stated that he found the petitioner's financial demands to be incredibly fascinating, especially considering the highly specific nature of the commercial debt in question. He informed Andre that the court had just received highly authenticated, legally binding documentation regarding the current ownership status of that exact $3 million loan. He noted that the commercial bank they kept referencing had aggressively executed a total divestment of the distressed asset just days prior to this hearing. Andre frowned deeply, casting a panicked, confused glance at his high-priced attorney. The lawyer frantically began flipping through his thick binders, completely blindsided by this sudden revelation. Kendrick sat up straight in the gallery, his face draining of all color, as his amateur financial brain struggled to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what was happening. Beatrice stopped her theatrical praising, her hands freezing mid-clap. Judge Harrison leaned forward, locking his steely gaze directly onto my ex-husband, ready to deliver the ultimate, completely inescapable execution. He dropped the bomb that would utterly annihilate their entire existence. It seems you are unaware that your debt was sold. The sole owner of your company's collateral, your mother's offshore assets, and this $3 million loan is your ex-wife, standing right in front of you. Section 12. 1,500 words. Absolute chaos erupted the very second those words left Judge Harrison's mouth. The heavy, oppressive silence of the courtroom completely shattered, replaced by a deafening wave of pure, unadulterated panic. Andre physically staggered backward, as if he had been violently struck. His knees buckled entirely, sending him crashing down into his heavy leather chair. The smug, arrogant facade he had worn like impenetrable armor completely evaporated, leaving behind the terrified, pale face of a man who just realized he had walked willingly into his own slaughter. His expensive corporate attorney frantically began digging through his thick legal binders, his hands shaking violently as he desperately searched for a loophole that simply did not exist. The lawyer stuttered, attempting to formulate an objection, but no coherent words formed in his throat. He looked at Andre with an expression of sheer horror, instantly recognizing that his client had just committed blatant, heavily recorded perjury under oath. In the gallery, the reaction was equally catastrophic. Beatrice gasped loudly, her hand flying to her chest as her pristine white silk scarf suddenly seemed to choke her. The heavy leather Bible slipped from her lap and hit the wooden floor with a loud thud, completely ignored. Vanessa shot up from her seat, her eyes darting frantically between her mother and her brother, desperately demanding an explanation that nobody could provide. Kendrick looked as though he was going to vomit. The flashy custom-fitted pinstripe suit he wore suddenly looked like a cheap costume. He gripped the wooden railing in front of him, his knuckles turning stark white as his amateur financial brain finally grasped the magnitude of my corporate takeover. He knew exactly what kind of digital trail he had left behind, and he knew that if I owned the debt, I owned the data. I did not wait for the noise to subside. I did not give them a single fraction of a second to recover their balance. I picked up my leather portfolio, stepped out from behind the respondent's table, and walked methodically toward the center of the room. I was no longer the discarded, humiliated wife they thought they could easily trample. I was the absolute master of their financial destruction. Judge Harrison slammed his heavy wooden gavel down 3 times in rapid succession, the sharp cracking sound demanding immediate order. The courtroom fell back into a stunned, terrified silence. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing the jacket of my charcoal suit, and looked directly up at the bench. I requested the court's permission to submit supplementary forensic evidence to officially support the ownership of the commercial debt and to clarify the exact nature of the marital assets currently in dispute. Judge Harrison nodded firmly, instructing the bailiff to retrieve the documents from my hands. I handed over the first heavily bound dossier. I kept my voice incredibly calm, completely devoid of any messy emotional inflection. I stated for the official legal record that the $3 million commercial loan my ex-husband just swore he acquired in good faith was actually secured through massive, highly coordinated identity theft. I directed the judge to page 4 of the submitted dossier. I explained that Andre and his chief financial officer, Kendrick, had purposefully forged my signature on the master collateral agreement to encumber my father's historic Buckhead estate. I provided the court with the certified forensic handwriting analysis I had expedited earlier that week. The expert report conclusively proved that the signature on the bank documents was a complete amateurish fabrication. I watched Andre physically shrink in his chair. I stated loudly that my ex-husband had intentionally committed severe bank fraud, pledging an asset he never owned to secure capital for a failing enterprise. But the forgery was only the initial layer of their profound criminal conspiracy. I handed the bailiff the second thick dossier. I informed the court that I had conducted a comprehensive forensic audit of the real estate technology company, utilizing my specialized access credentials. I explained that the company was not bankrupt due to poor market conditions or a lack of venture capital funding. The company was completely broke because Andre and Kendrick had actively siphoned the entire $3 million commercial loan directly out of the operational funds. I laid out the exact architecture of their illegal money laundering web. I detailed the domestic ghost corporations they had registered. I provided the exact routing numbers, the fabricated monthly invoices for non-existent marketing services, and the precise dates Kendrick authorized the fraudulent wire transfers. I explained how they bounced the stolen capital through regional banks in an aggressive placement and layering scheme designed to evade standard tax audits. Kendrick let out a strangled, pathetic noise from the gallery. He realized I possessed every single piece of his sloppy digital footprint. I did not stop there. I turned my attention to the ultimate destination of the stolen funds. I handed over the final, most devastating packet of evidence. I told Judge Harrison that the stolen money was eventually funneled through an international clearinghouse located in Miami before being permanently swept into an offshore wealth management trust based in the Cayman Islands. I stated the name of the shell company clearly for the court reporter to transcribe. I watched Beatrice physically recoil in the gallery pews. Her pristine, highly religious facade was actively melting off her face. I informed the judge that I had successfully obtained the unredacted offshore incorporation documents. I directed his attention to the final signature block, containing the name of the sole proprietor and exclusive managing director of the Cayman Trust, holding the stolen $3 million. I turned around slowly and looked directly at my mother-in-law. I pointed my finger squarely at her shaking figure. I announced to the entire courtroom that the mastermind holding the stolen corporate funds was none other than Beatrice. The woman who had spent the entire morning loudly praying for her victimized son, the prominent church elder who had viciously slandered my name across Atlanta, was an active co-conspirator in massive federal wire fraud. I explained that the heavy, highly publicized donations she recently made to her elite megachurch were entirely funded by the laundered money stolen from my family legacy. She had used stolen cash to buy her holy reputation and her designer suits while actively plotting to leave me homeless and drowning in massive debt. Beatrice opened her mouth to deny it, but absolutely no words came out. She was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the public exposure. Andre's expensive corporate attorney had heard enough. He immediately stood up, his face flushed with panic and extreme professional liability. He aggressively gathered his legal pads and shoved his binders back into his briefcase. He addressed Judge Harrison directly, stating that he had been entirely misled by his client regarding the fundamental facts of this case. He formally and immediately withdrew as Andre's legal counsel on the record, citing profound ethical conflicts. He did not wait for the judge to formally excuse him. The lawyer practically ran out of the courtroom, leaving Andre sitting entirely alone at the petitioner's table. Andre reached out desperately, trying to grab his lawyer's sleeve, begging him to stay, but the attorney violently yanked his arm away and shoved through the heavy wooden doors. Andre was now completely defenseless, utterly exposed and trapped in a cage of his own making. The stark reality of impending prison time finally broke through Beatrice's state of shock. The arrogant matriarch who had commanded absolute obedience from her family suddenly transformed into a terrified, desperate fugitive. She grabbed her expensive leather handbag, completely abandoned her fallen Bible on the floor, and scrambled out of the wooden gallery pew. She shoved past Vanessa, nearly knocking her own daughter over in her frantic rush to escape the courtroom. She sprinted toward the rear exit, her designer heels slipping clumsily on the polished floor. She thought she could simply walk away from the destruction she helped orchestrate. But Judge Harrison was not going to allow a massive federal criminal to simply stroll out of his jurisdiction. He slammed his gavel down and barked a sharp, commanding order. The towering armed bailiff intercepted Beatrice just inches from the double doors. He stepped squarely into her path, placing a firm, unyielding hand on her shoulder, effectively blocking her escape and forcing her to remain in the room to face the catastrophic consequences. With Beatrice detained and Andre completely paralyzed in his seat, I turned my attention to the final remaining pieces of their toxic family dynamic. I walked slowly over to the wooden partition, separating the gallery from the courtroom floor. Vanessa was hyperventilating, completely overwhelmed by the rapid, brutal dismantling of her family wealth and status. Kendrick sat rigidly beside her, sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit he could no longer reach. I reached into my leather portfolio and pulled out one last, highly specific manila folder. This folder had absolutely nothing to do with commercial loans or Cayman Island shell companies. This folder was deeply, intensely personal. I held it out over the wooden railing, offering it directly to Vanessa. Vanessa looked at this folder with profound suspicion and mounting dread. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and took it from my grasp. I kept my voice completely level, projecting a terrifying calm. I told Vanessa that since she loved to brag about her husband's immense financial success, she should probably see exactly how he chose to spend his executive bonuses. I watched her flip open the heavy cardstock cover. The first page she saw was a high-resolution itemized receipt from an ultra-luxury boutique hotel located just outside the Atlanta city limits. I had highlighted the exorbitant charges for premium room service and late-night couples spa treatments, but it was the authorized secondary guest name printed clearly at the top of the folio that made Vanessa's blood run entirely cold. It was the name of Andre's public relations director, the very same woman who had proudly taken my seat at the corporate anniversary gala. Vanessa frantically flipped to the next page, revealing the massive $15,000 invoice from the exclusive diamond importer in Buckhead. I leaned in slightly, making sure my words pierced directly through her materialistic armor. I casually reminded her that Kendrick had completely forgotten their wedding anniversary last month. I told her that the $15,000 diamond necklace was currently resting around the neck of her brother's mistress. I watched the horrible, agonizing realization shatter Vanessa's entire reality. Her husband was not a financial genius. He was a sloppy, cheating fraud who was actively using stolen money to fund a highly expensive secret life with another woman entirely behind her back. The explosion was instantaneous and incredibly violent. Vanessa dropped the folder, letting the incriminating hotel receipts and jewelry invoices scatter wildly across the gallery floor. She turned toward Kendrick, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She let out a piercing, blood-curdling scream that echoed fiercely through the high ceilings of the courtroom. She began aggressively hitting Kendrick's chest, screaming curses at him, demanding to know how he could betray her, how he could steal from her brother to fund his disgusting affairs. Kendrick threw his arms up desperately, trying to block her blows while stammering out pathetic, incoherent excuses. The pristine, highly arrogant image of their perfect luxury marriage completely disintegrated into a messy, humiliating public brawl. Judge Harrison did not bother banging his gavel to stop the chaotic screaming match in the gallery. He simply sat back in his elevated leather chair, adjusting his robes with a look of absolute, profound satisfaction. He had seen enough fabricated evidence and arrogant perjury to last a lifetime, and he was more than happy to watch this malicious family tear themselves apart from the inside out. He looked down at me, offering a very small, barely perceptible nod of profound respect for the absolute masterclass in forensic destruction I had just executed in his courtroom. The judge then shifted his gaze toward the back of the room. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, definitive signal to the second bailiff standing near the rear exit. The bailiff reached out and forcefully pushed the heavy wooden double doors wide open. The chaotic screaming in the gallery abruptly died down as heavy, synchronized footsteps echoed loudly from the marble hallway outside. A highly coordinated team of stern-faced federal agents wearing dark suits and tactical windbreakers bearing the bold, yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS walked purposefully into the courtroom to arrest every single person who had foolishly attempted to destroy my entire life and steal my father's enduring legacy. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with an uncompromising gaze, bypassed the gallery entirely and marched directly toward the petitioner's table. Andre did not even attempt to run or fight back. His legs had completely given out beneath him. He simply sat in his heavy leather chair, his mouth hanging open in silent, absolute terror as the agent slammed her hands flat onto the polished mahogany table. She read him his Miranda rights with a loud, commanding voice that echoed forcefully off the high ceilings. She listed the federal charges rapidly, specifying federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and multiple counts of severe perjury. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around Andre's wrists was the most beautiful, satisfying sound I had ever heard in my entire life. He looked over his shoulder at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic plea for mercy. I offered him absolutely nothing but a cold, unwavering stare. He had shown me zero mercy when he handed me that divorce petition, and I was returning the exact same ruthless energy. Two heavily armed IRS agents moved swiftly toward the gallery to secure Kendrick. He tried to scramble backwards over the wooden pews like a cornered rat, but his flashy pinstripe suit caught on the heavy oak armrest, sending him sprawling awkwardly to the floor. They hauled him roughly to his feet, reading off a massive list of federal indictments regarding international money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and severe tax evasion. Vanessa did not try to help her husband. She stood completely frozen against the back wall, clutching her designer handbag against her chest, watching in pure horror as the federal agents dragged Kendrick away. Her luxurious, highly funded fantasy world had just violently collapsed into a humiliating federal nightmare. She was left entirely alone, married to a broke, cheating felon, completely stripped of the unearned wealth she had aggressively flaunted just hours prior. She would soon have to explain to her affluent social circle why all her designer goods were being seized as evidence of a federal crime. But the most satisfying public downfall belonged entirely to Beatrice. The senior FBI agent approached the corner where she was being detained by the court bailiff. Beatrice immediately began to weep, letting out loud, heaving sobs of pure panic that distorted her perfectly applied makeup. She frantically tried to leverage her elite social status, loudly proclaiming to the federal agents that she was a highly respected elder at the largest megachurch in Atlanta. She cried out that this was all a massive misunderstanding, a terrible mistake orchestrated by a jealous, wicked daughter-in-law. The agent remained completely unfazed by her dramatic religious performance. She firmly grabbed Beatrice's arms, pulled them aggressively behind her back, and secured the cold steel handcuffs over her pristine white silk suit. The agent loudly informed Beatrice that she was being formally charged with managing an illicit offshore shell company and acting as the primary beneficiary in a multi-million-dollar international money laundering scheme. Beatrice wailed hysterically as she was marched down the center aisle of the courtroom. Her meticulously crafted reputation as a pious, untouchable pillar of the Atlanta elite was instantly and permanently obliterated. By the time the evening news aired across the city, every single member of her massive congregation would know exactly how she funded her extravagant church donations and custom designer hats. She would be forever banished from the high society circles she worshipped, remembered only as a greedy, hypocritical criminal who eagerly helped forge documents to steal her daughter-in-law's childhood home. I stood quietly at the respondents' table, watching the federal agents escort the three of them out through the heavy wooden double doors. Judge Harrison remained seated at his elevated bench, watching the entire spectacle with a look of stern, profound satisfaction. I gathered my pristine white envelope and my leather portfolio. I looked up at the judge and offered a deep, respectful nod of gratitude. He returned the gesture, a silent acknowledgement of the absolute irrefutable justice that had just been served in his courtroom. I turned and walked out of the double doors, leaving the chaotic, pathetic echoes of my former family behind me forever. I pushed through the main exit of the downtown courthouse and stepped out onto the wide concrete steps. The oppressive, humid gray clouds that had blanketed Atlanta all morning had suddenly broken apart, allowing bright golden sunlight to wash completely over the bustling city streets. I took a deep, grounding breath, filling my lungs with the fresh, clean air of absolute freedom. I was no longer weighed down by the toxic expectations of an ungrateful husband or the vicious judgments of his manipulative family. I was entirely liberated, standing victorious at the absolute peak of my personal and professional power. The financial execution I carried out over the next few weeks was swift, clinical, and completely devastating to Andre's remaining corporate legacy. Operating with absolute legal authority as the primary debt holder through Obsidian Asset Management, I triggered every single default clause on the $3 million commercial loan. I immediately seized total, uncompromising control of his real estate technology startup. I did not attempt to salvage his bloated, failing business model. Instead, I ruthlessly liquidated every single corporate asset he had ever acquired. I sold off his proprietary software algorithms to his biggest competitors, auctioned off his expensive executive office furniture, and terminated his entire arrogant executive board. I systematically stripped his technology empire down to the bare empty studs. The aggressive liquidation completely cleared the fraudulent debt associated with my name. I legally unsealed the master collateral agreement and permanently severed the toxic connection to my property. I reclaimed my father's historic Buckhead estate entirely debt-free, securing the deed in an impenetrable legal trust that ensured no one could ever leverage my family legacy against me again. But securing my own financial freedom was only the beginning of my ultimate victory. I knew there were thousands of women across the country trapped in the exact same terrifying financial abuse I had just escaped. Women whose partners used money debt and ruined credit scores as heavy, invisible chains to keep them silent and compliant. I took the substantial remaining profits generated from the ruthless liquidation of Andre's company and established a massive, fully funded nonprofit organization right in the heart of downtown Atlanta. I named it the Obsidian Financial Literacy and Protection Fund. The organization was dedicated explicitly to providing aggressive legal representation, emergency capital, and high-level forensic accounting services for African American women escaping severe financial abuse in their marriages. I hired a fleet of ruthless corporate attorneys and brilliant auditors to actively hunt down hidden marital assets, expose fraudulent domestic debt, and ensure that no woman would ever have to face a divorce hearing feeling small, destitute, and defenseless. I turned my profound personal betrayal into a powerful institutional shield for others in my community. 6 months later, I found myself standing perfectly still in the grand, sweeping foyer of my father's Buckhead estate. The massive crystal chandelier cast a warm golden glow across the polished hardwood floors. The house was completely quiet, totally devoid of the aggressive, toxic energy Andre used to bring into these sacred halls. The estate was breathing again, restored to the beautiful sanctuary of peace and black excellence my father had always intended it to be. I walked into the newly renovated kitchen, opened a customized, temperature-controlled wine fridge, and selected a highly exclusive, incredibly expensive bottle of imported red wine. I poured a generous measure into a crystal glass, savoring the rich, complex aroma. I walked out through the heavy French doors and stepped onto the expansive back patio. The sprawling, perfectly manicured lawn stretched out toward the dark tree line, illuminated by soft, elegant landscape lighting. The Georgia night air was warm and deeply comforting. I took a slow sip of the wine, letting the smooth, velvety taste ground me perfectly in the present moment. I stood alone in the absolute center of my reclaimed empire, completely at peace, and infinitely more powerful than I had ever been in my entire life. I had taken the worst betrayal imaginable and used it to forge an unbreakable titanium spine. I looked out into the quiet darkness, raised my crystal glass slightly in a silent toast, and spoke directly to anyone who has ever been forced to endure the suffocating weight of being utterly underestimated by the people they love. They will always try to convince you that your quiet dedication makes you weak. They will look at your daily sacrifices and arrogantly mistake them for submission. They will gladly drain your energy, your finances, and your spirit to build their own hollow kingdoms, fully expecting you to gratefully sweep up the debris they leave behind when they are finished with you. But let me tell you a secret that deeply terrifies arrogant people. The woman who quietly manages the foundation knows exactly where all the structural weaknesses are hidden. When they push you into the dark, when they try to publicly humiliate you and strip you of everything you have built, do not waste your precious energy crying or begging for a seat at a table you already bought and paid for. You dry your eyes, you gather your receipts, you let them bask in their foolish temporary victories, and then you silently buy the very ground they are standing on. Never let anyone convince you that you are just a disposable supporting character in their story. You are the architect of your own empire. And when they finally try to bury you under the weight of their malicious lies, remind them that they did not bury you at all. They planted you, and you are about to grow into a force of nature they can never ever control.